Here we have a couple of typical looking spark plugs, and these are out of one of my Ford trucks, out of my Ford F-150 to be exact. And in this video we're going to be discussing the heat range and what the difference there is between a hot and a cold plug. And we're going to be discussing gapping your spark plugs and the importance of doing that and how to do it properly. What you're going to be left with is information that is basic, but at the same time valuable on being able to tune up your car yourself and do it right. So first of all, let's talk about gapping your spark plugs. So the spark plug gap, it is important, and along with your combustion chamber pressure and the ignition timing, it all has a direct bearing on the amount of voltage that you would require from the ignition system. That makes sense, right? So the bigger the spark plug gap, the more voltage that you would require to have the spark arc across the gap, and vice versa. So let's see. First of all, we have a couple of tools here that are typically used. We have a disc feeler gauge, and we have a wire feeler gauge. The type that I like to use myself more often is the wire feeler gauge, and for one reason and one reason only. It's because the wires on it are rounded, so no matter what angle you put it in, it's going to give you the same reading. Whereas the disc, it requires a much steadier, a more steady hand, and you got to put it on dead center and right straight on, and not in an angle. If you put it on an angle, logically it's going to tell you that there's a smaller gap when indeed there's a larger gap. So it's not that huge of a difference, and I wouldn't say that this one is much more accurate, but I can say that the chances of being more accurate are greater with the wire one than with the disc one. It's really up to you which one you want to use. We're going to use this one to illustrate or to demonstrate how to gap your spark plugs. And I'll show you something on the other one too. But if you get your spark plugs from the auto parts stores, you'll notice a lot of times they'll tell you, or it says they're pre-gapped. It doesn't matter what it says, you still need to check them before you throw them inside the block or screw them into the engine block. And you would get this disc sort of feeler gauge and put it on the thinnest side and turn the disc until it stops on its own without you applying more pressure. And this one stops at 40. And what we want these spark plugs gapped at is at a 45. So that means I would have to increase the gap a little more if I wanted to be dead on accurate. So the way I would do that is I could actually use the other one to do a similar thing, but I'm going to show you this feature on the wire one. You would not put the adjuster in this way. You would put it in this way here. And if you want to open the gap, you push it backward. And if you're going to close the gap, you'd pull it forward. So in this case, we want to open it just slightly. So I put minimal pressure and just a little tug there. And then I recheck it and see where it stops. And it stopped right at a 45. And that's great. So now this plug is ready to be installed on the vehicle. Now, the other part about the gapping of the spark plug, there's a couple things to remember, is that when you increase the spark plug gap, you'll need more voltage from the ignition coil to create a spark across the spark plug gap. So when it comes to gapping your spark plugs, you need to gap it wide enough so that it burns hot, but not so wide that it slips or it misses at high speeds while driving, causing that particular cylinder to drag or the engine to rattle or anything like that. Let me give you some pros and cons actually of a narrow gap or a wide gap. On a narrow gap spark plug, if you gap it, I mean a little bit more narrow than what the manufacturer specs are, the con about it is that the spark might be too weak or too small to ignite the fuel. Now on the pro side of a narrow gapping is that the plug always fires on each cycle. So you have that helps in when it's cold out, if you live in a cold region. If you have the spark plugs gapped a little more on the narrow side, you're going to get a quicker and more of a sure start when it's cold out, or actually at any time. Now if you gap your spark plugs a little wider than what's recommended, more on the wider side of a gap, then the con is that the plug might not fire, especially if it's cold out, or if the engine is worn. If the plugs are worn and you have a wide gap, it's going to be very hard to start that engine. Or it could miss when you're driving at high speeds or at hard throttle. On the pro side of having a wide gap on your spark plug is that the spark is strong and it has a very clean burn. So those are a few tips that you can use when gapping your spark plug. If you have any more questions about that are more in depth than the scope of this video, then you can go ahead and comment on the video, and I'll give you the answer in the comments. If it's a long answer, then I'll just private message you. So feel free to do that if you need to. Like I said, I'm trying to be as basic as possible on this video and just give you what's on the top of my head without going too deep. So now let's talk about the heat range. The heat range of the spark plugs. First of all, I'm going to show you a drawing, and I'm a very poor drawer. I don't have a talent to draw. I know a lot of you do, so I apologize ahead of time, but this will still fit the bill. I will still convey the right point that I need to get across to you. So, hot and cold plugs. We have a heat range. And basically the heat range just simply means the ability of the spark plugs to dissipate heat. Okay? So, on a hot plug, the difference is it has a longer insulator. And the electrode, along with the insulator, comes out further outside the spark plug, so it's much closer to the engine block itself. Whereas on a cold plug, you have a shorter insulator, so there's less heat travel, and it's more the electrode and the insulator are more inside the plug. There's less of it exposed, and that's the difference between the two. And to make it simple, like just to refresh it, is just a shorter insulator, a cold plug. Then you got a hot plug with a longer insulator. And we're going to see, I'll show it to you right now on a real spark plug so that it's more understood. But before I do that, also keep in mind something else. The cold plug has a fast heat transfer in a lower heat range, whereas the hot plug is a slower heat transfer in a higher heat range. So the cold plug would be ideal for if the majority of your driving is long distance or at higher speeds, then a cold plug would be good, would be recommended. If your majority of your driving is, if the majority or almost all of it is done at slower speeds, or you do a lot of stop and go, then you need a hotter plug. But you also, the other thing to remember is you don't need to worry so much about a hot and cold plug if you just get the recommended plug for your car from the auto parts store. You don't need to worry of whether it's a hot or cold plug unless you're doing specific driving. Like all you do is like drive your vehicle around like a farm. You do some short stops and goes and some work around there, and that's it. You never take it on the highways, the freeways, or drive it at high speeds. Then you would do better with a hot plug. The plugs have numbers on them and on the box that you can tell what the heat range is. But just looking at it, you can see how this plug here has a very long insulator tube. And that insulator is actually aluminum oxide ceramic. It's not a porcelain, it's an aluminum oxide ceramic. And so this is obviously a hot plug. You can just tell by what I described and the way this is designed. That's a hot plug. So there's a couple things to remember when choosing the proper heat range for your spark plug. Just keep in mind that if you choose a spark plug that's too hot, it could actually fracture because of the excessive heat, or become a hot spot in your combustion chamber, and that will cause pre-ignition and detonation sooner or later. But on the other hand, if you choose a spark plug that's too cold for what you're going to use it for, then the spark plugs will become fouled very easy. And there's a few tips for you. I hope this helps, and again, if anybody has any questions or comments, put them in the comments box. If you have any specific questions and they're too long for me to answer in the comments, I will send you a private message. Thanks a lot. Have a good night.